W. Bush, our 41st President of the United States. And I think about the first time I got to meet this gentleman. Upon graduating from college back in 1979, I moved to Dallas, Texas, home to then a booming economy with lots of jobs in finance, which as a brand new college graduate was my hopeful profession. That fall, I was invited by friends to join the committee of young people sponsoring an informal barbecue for a possible presidential candidate. The candidate's name was George Bush from Houston, Texas. It was a terrific evening. I met Mr. Bush. I made a lot of new friends in my adopted town of Dallas. Little did I know, just 10 years later, I would be working for him in his administration as he became the 41st President of the United States. 3 years after meeting in 1982, I took the advice of a good friend of George Bush's, Elvis Mason, CEO of the Dallas-based banking corporation from whom I worked, and accepted an appointment to move to Washington, D.C. and handle the banking committee staff responsibilities for Senator John Tower of Texas. These were the exciting early days of the first term of President Ronald Reagan, and while George Bush had not been elected president in 1980, he was selected to join President Reagan's winning ticket as vice president. It was during this time that I learned firsthand of the incredible warmth and generosity of George and Barbara Bush. It was their custom to invite young staffers from Texas to events at the vice president's residence in Washington. I'll never forget one holiday season where I was sitting on the floor in front of the fireplace with Barbara Bush, cross-legged as she was telling stories to all of us assembled in the room. Martha and I both volunteered for the 1988 Bush for President campaign and were thrilled when he was elected that November. His election as president witnessed the most qualified person in the history of our country to be elected to the role of chief executive. Bush had been a standout athlete, a decorated U.S. Navy fighter pilot, as Congresswoman Van Dyne pointed out, and a pioneering, successful business entrepreneur in the oil fields of Texas and in the cutting edge of the critically important niche of deep water, offshore oil and gas drilling. But at age 40, and the father of 5 children, George Bush was called to public service. First, he was elected the Harris County, Texas Republican chairman. At the time, Republicans were in an ascent with the amazing special election win in May 1961 by John Tower to replace the Senate vacancy left by Lyndon Johnson, becoming President Kennedy's vice president. Bush's initial foray into the rough and tumble Texas elected politics was a flop. He was defeated in 1964 in a U.S. Senate race against the incumbent populist Democrat Ralph Yarborough. But he dusted himself off and made a major rebound by announcing his candidacy for Texas's 7th congressional district in January 1966. This brought about one of my favorite stories about the Bushes. After he announced his candidacy on a Saturday, the following Monday morning, Barbara was driving then 6-year-old Doro to school in her carpool. One of the little girls in the car said to Doro, "Hey, I saw your daddy on television last night." A third child in the car said, "You did? What was he doing?" And Doro responded, "Oh, you know, it was about that erection that he's going to have." Now, Mrs. Bush's response was typical, as reported by biographer John Meacham. Needless to say, we have to work on the word election. Bush would go on to win that race for Congress and would be the first freshman to win a seat on the prestigious Ways and Means Committee since 1904. He served there with distinction in this House, but his itch and ambition were far higher. And he once again took a risk, like he did when he moved from the East to West Texas in the oil fields, and in that first race for Congress that he lost. And Bush decided to throw his hat in the ring for the 1970 race for the United States Senate against the former Democratic Congressman Lloyd Bentsen. Bush's continued ambitions for the Senate were enhanced by his April 1969 visit with former President Lyndon Johnson out at LBJ's ranch near Austin to test out his idea of another try at the Senate. The story went something like this. Mr. President, I've got a decision to make, and I'd like your advice. My House seat is secure, no opposition like last time, and I've got a position on Ways and Means. I don't mind taking risks, but in a few more terms, I'll have seniority on a very powerful committee. I'm just not sure it's a gamble I should take, whether it's really worth it. Well, President Johnson made a very characteristic reply to Bush. He said, "Son, I've served in the House, and I've been privileged to serve in the Senate, too, and they're both good places to serve. So I wouldn't begin to advise you what to do, except to say this, that the difference between a member of the Senate and the member of the House is the difference between chicken salad and chicken fill in the blank." For effect, Johnson paused and he said, "Son, do I make my point?" He did make his point for sure, but that didn't help George Bush win that Senate race. Between his leaving the House and being elected Vice President of the United States in 1980, the now former congressman was appointed by Presidents Nixon and Ford to a series of senior critical leadership positions in our government. UN ambassador for 2 years, followed by a year and a half as chairman of the Republican National Committee, including during the Nixon-Watergate resignation crisis. Then moving to Beijing as our top diplomat just 2 years after the famous Nixon opening. And followed that by a key job at the helm as the 11th director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1976 to 1977. For George and Barbara Bush, this pattern of appointments made them wonder, is this a way to sidetrack him from his own goal, which was to be elected President of the United States? He viewed serving as the Republican National Committee chair at the height of Watergate a thankless task. And now to be called back from China to take over the CIA, which had been battered by a decade of hostile congressional investigations, exposés, and charges that ran from lawbreaking to simple incompetence. It seemed like truly for him a dead end politically. But Bush's dad, former U.S. Senator Prescott Bush, had always told him that if the president asks, you have a duty to say yes. So the Bush family moved back to Washington, D.C. to face the hostile Senate confirmation for a job he wasn't even sure he wanted. But with the Church Commission reforms being implemented by Congress, crafting a new approach to intelligence community oversight, it ended up that he was, in fact, the right man at the right time. In this Congress, I'm privileged to serve on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the companion to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, both creations of the aftermath of that Church Commission and the need for greater, more intensive congressional oversight of the intelligence community. And having now served on this committee, I recognize the exceptional role these two oversight committees play and what a fine job George Bush did in his 12 months sitting in the corner office on the 7th floor of the CIA headquarters building. It was an intensive 1 year. He testified before Congress over 50 times and made 21 public appearances. It was clear that he defended the important role of the intelligence community and rebuilt the morale that had been so destroyed internally by decades of bad decision-making and externally by the brutal battering ram of congressional investigation. But he ended up loving the job and deeply respecting the work of the officers and analysts. As he left at the beginning of the Jimmy Carter administration, he said, "This is the most interesting job I've ever had. That includes Congress, the United Nations, Peking, and the RNC." So it's fitting that the CIA headquarters building in Langley, Virginia, is named for President Bush. So as George Bush entered the vice presidency in January 1981, his extraordinary career was finally put fully to work. It was this 8 years of final exceptional preparation as VP that would be put to the ultimate test as the 41st president. 10 years from our first meeting at that barbecue as a young person in 1989, it was such a privilege to join his administration, first at the Treasury and later as a member of his White House staff. While he was only in office one term, he achieved so many foreign and domestic wins, like witnessing the fall of communism and the resulting unification of Germany, or ejecting Saddam Hussein for his illegal invasion of Kuwait, to domestic successes, such as cleaning up the savings and loan financial debacle of the 1980s, the amendments to the Clean Air Act, or the initiation of the Americans for Disabilities Act, and highlighting the success of just ordinary Americans, helping their fellow citizens every day through his still prominent Points of Light initiative. Despite these exceptional legislative and policy successes, there were disappointments. For me, the first was the rejection by the United States Senate of John Tower, his friend, my old boss, to serve as Secretary of Defense. Tower would have been an outstanding secretary, and the attacks on him were personal, not policy. But most disappointingly and most controversial aspect of his presidency, which contributed to the tough loss in 1992, was his decision in 1990 to include tax increases as a part of a major deficit reduction package. His 1988 campaign speech included his famous, made infamous line, open quote, "Read my lips, no new taxes," close quote. It blew up in his face. With a slowing economy, continued tough real estate markets following the savings and loan crisis, along with high gas prices resulting from Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the U.S. economy entered a brief recession. A combination of slowing economy and higher taxes was not a political winner. After the presidency, the former president and a very, very proud father witnessed two of his fine sons being elected governors of Florida and Texas, and his son, George, going on to be elected the 43rd president of the United States. What a powerful legacy of service. And as I reflect on the life and legacy of George Bush, one always focuses on just what a good man he was, what a fine president he was. My wife, Martha, who also worked for President Bush during his time in office, always described the president as the perfect person to put on that form we've all filled out 1,000,000 times. In case of emergency, please call. George Bush was that solid business partner, that caring neighbor, that great, intimate, personal friend. George and Barbara dearly loved their 5 children, George, Jeb, Neil, Marvin, Doro, and honored daily the memory of a 6th, Robin, who died in 1953 at age 3 from leukemia. Robin was such a tremendous inspiration in the Bushes' lives and in their lifelong dedication to philanthropic support for cancer research. Over their lives, George and Barbara Bush's efforts resulted in some $90 million being raised for research at Houston's MD Anderson. But to know George Bush and Barbara Bush is to be grateful for their compassion, patriotism, and tremendous sense of humor. Even in the gloom of the 1992 loss, a few days after the election, all of the White House staff officers got a message. The president has invited you to an important meeting in the East Room of the White House. So we all assembled at the appointed time, and an offstage announcer said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President and Mrs. Bush." And then in walked Dana Carvey, impersonating Bush, holding Mrs. Bush's hands, waving his way into the East Room and up onto the dais. President Bush strolled in, laughing hysterically behind the pair. President Bush and Dana Carvey then outdid each other, imitating President Bush's quirky, funny mannerisms. It brightened the spirits of those loyal White House staffers in the face of a historic presidential campaign loss. The president's typical, upbeat, optimistic outlook on life endeared his legacy in the hearts of all those assembled. So as we commemorate the centennial of the birth of this good man, devoted dad, and terrific President of the United States, we know that our country is better off because George H.W. Bush was born on June 12, 1924, and that he devoted his life to the betterment of our nation.